Is that collusion I smell? The Falcons are reportedly out on Lamar Jackson. We'll talk about why on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, the most humble host who's been so humbled by the Baltimore Ravens on today's episode. Stay tuned to the end of the show to watch me eat that crow because I'm so humble of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast. Your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And make sure you make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And if you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku or Amazon Fire TV. So today I'm joined by my illustrious guest, none other than Alansterk, who manages content for Odyssey, former co-host of the Locked On Falcons podcast, former co-host of the Falc Fans podcast, and a frequent contributor over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons. And yesterday I told you that, I'm going to eat crow on today's episode if the Baltimore Ravens use the non-exclusive franchise tag on Lamar Jackson. And I was very insistent that it wouldn't happen. And of course, today we found out that it did happen, which means that NFL teams are free to pursue Lamar Jackson and sign him to an offer sheet. And if the Ravens elect not to match that offer sheet, they will receive 2 first-round picks. And another thing I got wrong on yesterday's episode saying is if that happened, the Falcons would definitely be in on Lamar Jackson. Well, once again, I am humbled here on this illustrious podcast because we found out within 20 minutes of the news dropping that Lamar was tagged, that the Falcons were one of several teams not interested in Lamar Jackson. So, Alan, my friend, what is your reaction to all of this with Lamar Jackson and the Falcons not being invested in pursuing him at this time?
The immediate reaction is that, I predict first-round picks, but when it comes to the franchise tag, you're not about that life. You can predict A.J. Terrell, but Lamar Jackson's future, no. But it is a stunner. Now, granted, there has been brewing conflict, I would say, since December. If you check out some of John Harbaugh's press conferences, he's kind of sounded jaded when Lamar Jackson is mentioned. They didn't necessarily back him up. Some people said it's more frustration of the situation than the player itself, but I don't know. You don't see the backing of a franchise quarterback when it comes to that situation compared to other teams. Like, you just never have truly seen that. And we've seen the articles, we've seen the reports, and I think everything's kind of coming to fruition where it's just like, okay, they're going to see what team is out there that's going to put these draft picks on the board and, what's the best option. And I think now the Ravens are a bit caught off guard based on reports that a lot of these teams, Falcons, Panthers, Commanders, Raiders, aren't necessarily ready to, load up the artillery and make something happen. So I think just across the board, everyone's stunned today. From obviously the non-exclusive tag, and then now just seeing the reports of like which teams that you would expect to be in the quarterback market are totally backing away.
Well, I think what's interesting about this is, to me, this is a game of chicken between the Ravens and Lamar Jackson, right? Like, essentially, them putting the non-exclusive tag on him is them basically saying, okay, if you want fully guaranteed, go get you a fully guaranteed contract, which to me is ballsy, but clearly based off of the last few hours, the Ravens are sort of, I wouldn't say calling Lamar's bluff, but, that's kind of the way it goes in terms of playing that game of chicken. And, a lot of accusations have come up in the last few hours since all this news started dropping on Tuesday, that there is collusion involved. And we kind of touched upon it, or at least I kind of touched upon it on yesterday's episode. where I talked about how Arthur Blank, being an owner, doesn't want to get the side eye from other owners, like what presumably Jimmy Haslam, the Browns owner, is getting from the rest of the league when he decided to go out there and do a fully guaranteed contract for Deshaun Watson last year. And, basically this Lamar situation, I think, can kind of be boiled down to being basically a proxy war between the NFL and the NFLPA. And, the NFLPA is pushing for player empowerment and getting that fully guaranteed contract, getting another one on the books just to, underline that precedent set by the Browns. And of course, the NFL and the owners are like, nah, as they often are. So I'm just curious, where do you come down on that particular aspect of it?
I wish I had a strong opinion because there's a lot to digest. Like Deshaun Watson really changed the market like this? Like this is the signing that made owners have this trepidation because we're talking about former MVP. Like, look, we don't need to list Lamar Jackson's accomplishments. Like, his resume speaks for itself. So I think it's just baffling how someone who I would say you have to consider top 5, top 7 quarterback in a league where look we're striving to top level quarterback play. Like teams, I think would do a lot for it. There's teams that are 1 or 2 players away, but some teams can be that quarterback to get them over the top. So I don't know. It's hard to digest. I wish I had a stronger opinion on it. I'd like to hear your take on it, but I think there is clear legs to it when it comes to collusion.
Okay, we'll get my opinion on it, and we'll do that sort of coming up on today's episode, and we'll discuss sort of the idea of, is it worthwhile to pay a top 5 to top 7 type of quarterback? You think that's a worthwhile discussion, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, who isn't? Well, I don't think it's a polarizing discussion. Like, look at how championship teams have been built. Let's see the San Francisco Niners that know how to draft properly and have coaches that literally, or coordinators that become head coaches within 2 years. Like, I think the 49ers are kind of an outlier. As much as I love how they built their roster, I don't think that's necessarily something that you could replicate.
Well, I maybe I'll have a polarizing opinion on that, and we'll get into that over, I guess, my controversial opinion that, I think it's worthwhile to pay the top tier quarterbacks, but I don't know if Lamar quite fits into that top tier of quarterbacks. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons here with Alansterk. But we are past the midway point of the NBA season, and it is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. And new customers will get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 when they get bonus bets back if their first bet doesn't win. All you got to do is download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use. I haven't checked FanDuel today and looked at the app yet since the news of Lamar Jackson breaking, but I'm wondering if they have odds on who Lamar Jackson's next team is going to be. And of course, you could check that out, as well as, go check out the lines for whoever your favorite NBA team like the Hawks is, and bet against the point spread, bet the money line, or build yourself a parlay by looking at the amount of points that you expect Trae Young to score in the next Hawks game, or the amount of rebounds that you think, whoever else on the Hawks.
Clint Capella, come on, Aaron. Brad Rowland somewhere shaking his head right now. He's expecting Atlanta content to be better produced.
Whoever you want to put that money on, you can build that parlay at FanDuel. So don't miss out on your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Aaron still thinks the Spurs are a top 3 NBA team.
Tim Duncan, man, he's been killing it lately. But let's get back on topic. You said paying quarterbacks, and again, I think it's my controversial opinion, and probably this is a whole podcast in and of itself. But for me, like, I could see both sides of the whole, will they, won't they, with the Falcons going after Lamar. Like, I could understand why the Falcons would pursue Lamar because of their belief that he is one of those, upper tier, top tier quarterbacks. But I was a little skeptical of that because I don't value Lamar in that way. And I guess my controversial opinion is I think for a legit top 5 to 7 quarterback, and I guess I got to use air quotes because that's subjective, right? Like a Joe Burrow, of course, Patrick Mahomes, that type of guy. It's worth paying the premium for the quarterback. I don't know if Lamar's at that level because my biggest concern with Lamar is that once you pay him the money that you're going to pay him, you're going to need to protect your investment. And you're going to do that by dialing back the runs that he has in the offense, right? He's still going to be, the running's still going to be a factor because of scrambles and all that stuff. But if you're guaranteeing, say, $50 million to him a year for the next 55 years, you're going to not want to put him in harm's way by dialing back those design runs. And the question I have for Lamar is if you take out the run game element or you dial it back, what you're left with, I don't know, is one of those top 5 to 7 quarterbacks. I think what you're left with is maybe one of the top 10 to 12 quarterbacks, which is not necessarily a problem, but I think paying the type of money that you're paying, it'd be no different than paying Kirk Cousins, $50 million, because Kirk Cousins is in that same sort of grouping of the top 10 to 12 quarterbacks or wherever you want to do. And so I think that's more problematic than, it's worth. And I think if you can get, say, Desmond Ridder, if he's the 15th best quarterback, but he's only making $5 million, that's more advantageous for your football team than having the 10th best quarterback at $50 million.
Like, you make some strong points, but I don't think they would dial it back significantly when it comes to the design runs. I think they would run a lot with Lamar. I think just with Arthur Smith's offense, because we saw quite a bit of Mariota, a little bit of Ridder. Obviously, Jackson's, he's in a tier of his own when it comes to running. But I just think they would probably run it 8 to 12 times a game. They would structure those runs. I think they would manage it better than Baltimore did, because I think obviously, like, Lamar Jackson has never had a supporting. If he was in Atlanta, he would never have a supporting cast quite like it before. Like, we know the Ravens are notorious for not drafting receivers well. They have players on the roster that are quite upset with the GM for certain comments. So I think having a better head, start calling with his creativity and the variety of blocking designs. Imagine Lamar Jackson running behind Chris Lindstrom and McGary Island himself. Like, come on, they'd be moving people. So I think they would. I don't think it would dial it back. So that's why Lamar, and it's understandable the concerns about him as a pocket passer, because it is known, like the Ravens, when they go down to, say, tend to fade in games. Like, we saw that at Lamar at his peak. But at the same time, I do think Greg Roman was a huge hindrance in Lamar Jackson's progression, which is why I still believe in Lamar to be a top 5, top 7 caliber quarterback, and not necessarily as a pure passer. But the running is definitely something that elevates him to this type of tier. But I think we're just projecting this point. It's not going to happen. But I don't think there would be a significant drop. Like, I still think he would be an elite talent in Atlanta, and to see what type of work he would do on those RPOs would be something to watch.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not going to happen. It's still possible that the Falcons could circle back and pursue Lamar, but probably only if his contract demands go down. Because I think that's going to be the sticking point for all these teams. But you mentioned the supporting cast, and I can push back a little bit on that, because, like, I think when we talk about the team, right, the supporting cast that the Ravens, when you look at the Ravens defense, is what you hope the Falcons will build towards, and have a top 10 defense every year, which has been pretty much the case outside of 2021 when the Ravens had a bunch of injuries on that side of the ball, with Lamar as a starter. The Ravens have had good offensive lines in his time, although injuries have impacted that the last couple of years, especially with injuries to, like, Ronnie Stanley. They've had a top 10 rushing attack. So really, to me, when you talk about the supporting cast that he would have in Atlanta versus what he's had in Baltimore, you're essentially making the argument that having Kyle Pitts and Drake London is significantly better than having Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown? And do you truly believe that, like, I get the understanding, and what you're saying is, like, I think it's definitely true to a certain extent, that Lamar not having that true blue number one wideout has been a big factor that has limited, the potential of that Ravens team, as well as Greg Roman's play calling. But I'm not convinced that having Pitts in London is drastically better and somehow going to unlock a whole new level of Lamar as a passer.
It's not just that, man. I think Greg Roman and Arthur Smith is a huge difference. And I know Greg Roman is a run game specialist. I'm not trying to totally discredit Greg Roman for his success, because he's built a pretty long career in the NFL. But at the same time, I don't think he's quite evolved as a play caller. I think he's kind of archaic in his style. So that's another reason why I do believe the supporting cast would make a big significant difference, just because I think Arthur Smith, I fully trust him as a play caller. Situational management could use some work, don't get me wrong, but I think from a play calling standpoint, especially with the red zone efficiency that Arthur Smith we saw in Tennessee and it's starting to grow in Atlanta, I think he just turned Lamar and this offense into a huge juggernaut.
Okay, I think that's fair. I mean, that's the bet that you're making. If you're betting on Lamar, you're betting that what we have seen so far, or at least what we've seen the last couple of years, obviously, getting him back to the 2019 level, the MVP level, is what you're shooting for. But I think you're making the bet, if you're acquiring Lamar, that you're going to get more out of him than what Baltimore got out of him. And I don't think that's a crazy idea, right? I don't know if I look at the Falcons receiving options as like massively better than the Ravens receiving options, or at least their top two receiving options the last couple of years.
We have free agency to figure it out. We'll see. Corey Davis, when's the cap casually happening?
Well, Corey Davis is going to be the thing that pushes this Falcons offense into a whole different trajectory.
I'm a firm believer, man. Bring me back 2020 Corey Davis or DJ Chark. I'm not going to plug a certain article that came out today, but maybe I'll save it for the end. Okay.
All right. Well, any last thoughts on Lamar before we move on to other free agent news of the day with the Falcons, and not tagging Kaleb McGary and what is his future? And
that's the real travesty here, Aaron. But also, it is a letdown. Let's talk it from like a just personal standpoint. I know you're not as high on Lamar, but I just think it would just raise the spirit of the franchise and put them at some sort of level where it's just like, okay, I think we can now really take them seriously. And I think they can compete with the majority of teams in the NFC. We're not going to get discussion of around league, but because the AFC is such a powerhouse conference. But I do think that just the buildup of it, like there was genuine anticipation, and I just from listening to different podcasts, listening to you, even though you're not as in tune with Lamar, I still think, man, like it's been such a great fit. I just want to see like that Lamar Jackson, Arthur Smith, like, that could just really, take the league by storm. And this division is so wide open. And look, the Falcons obviously aren't in win now mode. They're still very much in the roster building process, but it's been a hard 5 years. So let's just say a lot of empty seats, a lot of December games that didn't really mean much. So I just think it would have totally lifted the spirits. But you don't run your organization by lifting the spirits of. You got to think logically. So look, if they want to go up to draft capital, like, it's understandable. But the initial reaction to Diana Rossini's tweet and just seeing the reaction was just, across the board off Falcons Twitter was just like, ugh. Like, man, this really happened? Like to quote Ted Lasso, it's the hope that kills you.
Never seen a single second of Ted Lasso, but I appreciate the quote.
You don't have good taste. What are you going to
do? I just don't have Apple TV currently on my TV. That's all. Yeah, I agree with you. It would have gotten a buzz going. It would have definitely gotten a different energy in the building and in the city. And I'm sure to a lot of people a much needed buzz and energy. And I'm sure Arthur Smith Arthur Blank, I'm sorry, is gonna cry himself to sleep tonight because he's just thinking about, man, we could have jacked up them PSLs if we got Lamar. So we'll see if the Falcons circle back to that. But there's still a possibility that they could create that energy by using that pick that they wind up keeping. that first round pick that they wouldn't be giving to the Ravens on a quarterback. So that will, I'm sure, be a continued topic of conversation on Locked On Falcons over the next 8 weeks between now and the draft. But we'll leave that aside for today and wrap up today's episode talking about the other Falcons free agent news, which is Kaleb McGary is not being tagged, but does that mean he's staying here in Atlanta? And one player that we know is staying here in Atlanta is Lorenzo Carter, and we'll get into what his role will be on his new contract here with Alansterk to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But speaking of the Falcons draft plans, why not check out the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast, your daily podcast breaking down the NFL draft, hosted by Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez of the Draft Network. And of course, you can find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So let's wrap up today's episode here, Alan, and talk about Kaleb McGary not getting the tag. And in all likelihood, I will probably go deeper on the case for and against keeping Kaleb McGary on tomorrow's episode. At least that's the tentative plan at this point in time. And we'll see, I guess, with Kaleb McGary, if he makes it to market, in a week or so, or the Falcons are some way able to lock him up to a deal in the next couple of days before that happens. But what are your thoughts on the decision to not tag Kaleb McGary? And what do you think the Falcons should do in regards to keeping him or letting him go?
It was a bit surprising because they clearly, even though he was from the previous regime, we know the Falcons are notorious for valuing their first rounders, even though with Terry Fott now, we don't quite know where his head is at yet, but it's a team that, if their first round is playing well, Arthur Blank wants to make sure that, kind of like the Giants, like we got to keep our homegrown players here. And I just think Arthur Smith really likes Kaleb McGary as well. So I think that relationships there and just how he fits with the run blocking scheme. But overall, I just think the pass blocking limitations is something that would make me feel really concerned about giving him a long-term deal. I know teams out there are still starving for right tackles. Like a team like San Francisco, wouldn't be surprised if they made a play. Do you know the coach in Chicago? I'm blanking on his name right now. I don't know if it's offensive line coach or their offensive coordinator, but he was with the Falcons when they drafted McGary, but I'm blanking on his name. Who is it?
Chris Morgan.
Chris Morgan, yes. Okay, so the Bears are another team I think would be interested because say we want by McGary, and he is a mauler in the run game, and that ferocity, that edge is what teams crave, especially finesse offensive line. So, the quote-unquote grittiness that we like to joke about, Kaleb McGary possesses that. So, look, he is going to have a huge market, but in this kind of league where at some point you're going to need to drop back 30, 35 times a game, McGary still has those short arms. He still has the slow feet that just don't go away. And you could only give him chip help for so long. So, I am definitely not in favor of signing to a max deal.
Okay. Yeah. Just off screen, I have a dartboard with Chris Morgan's face glued to it. Yeah, I have similar sentiments. Like, I think I get why, if the Falcons do wind up bringing McGary back, why you want it, to have that stability and continuity on your offensive line. It's been so unstable these last, 5 years. And you don't want to risk that. But at the same time, I think, it's realistically quite likely, I would argue, that the Falcons can upgrade that position with a much cheaper player. Maybe that player doesn't immediately step in, if they draft a player, which is what I'm referring to. Maybe that player doesn't immediately step in and be that upgrade, but within a year or two, you would hope that with Dwayne Ledford's coaching, as opposed to Chris Morgan's coaching, Chris Morgan didn't coach. Shout out to Justin Fields. Stay safe out there, my guy. But, with Dwayne Ledford's coaching, I think you feel optimistic that, you can get a young, talented offensive tackle in this year's draft, and that player with further development, may not have the limitations that you referred to in terms of pass blocking that Kaleb McGary has. But we'll leave the Kaleb McGary conversation aside because we'll get deeper into that tomorrow.
I'm stunned. It sounds like you're departing McGary Island.
Look, I used this analogy like last week that, boats come by to get me off the island, and I'm getting off the island. I'm tired of drinking coconut water and having diarrhea all day on this stinking island. So I'm done with that.
All right, that's a hell of a it's not an image I want in the vision, but it's a hell of a line. Like I appreciate the creativity, but yikes.
All right. So let's talk about Lorenzo Carter. He resigned this morning. Reports are that it's a 2-year deal worth $9 million with $5.25 million guaranteed. My best guess, and we'll see what the details are. Probably they come out a week or two from now. But my best guess is that initial cap hit in year one is going to be about 3.25 million and probably 5.75 million in year two. It'll essentially work out to be a 1-year deal, and then we'll see. When I first saw the news this morning, I was really meh on it because I'm like, really? Okay, I guess. But then once seeing the terms, I'm like, okay, that's much more reasonable. I don't have as much a problem with it. He wasn't necessarily a high priority for me for the Falcons to re-sign. I'm sure he's a pretty good locker room guy, but I recall you being on record being in favor of the Falcons bringing back Lorenzo Carter. So I'm assuming you like this deal.
I was in favor of it, but I didn't think it would be such a high priority. So that's why I was surprised initially at first. But once you see the contract, it's like, how can you object this? Like, because to me, I think Isaiah Oliver should be that priority, and I would value actually Rashaan Evans over him, which I know is a little bit surprising. Just as a veteran presence, I don't be so sad.
That hurt me.
Look, I like Rashaan Evans more than most people. Lorenzo Carter, he is kind of in the Cord Bierman role where it's just, if he plays 20 to 25 snaps, I think people will grow to appreciate him. If he plays 45 to 50 snaps, you're going to grow to be really frustrated with his lack of productivity. So I think based on the contract, maybe they could get the most out of him. It's just and I don't want to base too much here because we don't know what kind of defense Ryan Nielsen's running. But just looking at what was going on in New Orleans, it's just Carr doesn't really fit the profile of an edge defender, of a player that Ryan Nielsen would coach up. So I'm just curious, is he just going to be more of a situational pass rusher? Because I just don't see him play on base down. So, yeah, it was a surprising move at first. But look, in flashes, I think Lorenzo Carter does bring some sort of explosiveness. And, I just think he's got to play less snaps. And, at first I was a bit underwhelmed, but I'm just like, now it's like, all right, it's cool. But, I think the Falcons still have some work to do, particularly with Isaiah Oliver. And, look, man, they bring back Rashaan Evans. Why not?
Yeah, I'll just let that go. I think if you're the way I was thinking about it this morning, like if you're looking for a Saints analog, you're probably looking at Lorenzo Carter being kind of what Carl Granderson was this past year or two. Just kind of a rotational guy, can probably play on as a run defender. I think he does a pretty good job as a run defender. I think the value of Carter on passing situations wasn't really his pass rushing ability, at least for the Falcons previously. Like, it was his ability to drop into coverage because of all the different sims and creepers that Dean Pease theoretically wanted to run, that he didn't ultimately run that many this past year. And so like Carter's coverage ability and the ability to be comfortable being your not typical edge when it comes to dropping into coverage made him valuable in that regard. And so I questioned whether that was going to be a big part of the scheme. But again, I think if they're envisioning him to kind of do what Ade Ogundeji did in the defense this year, which is kind of be a primary run defender and will get pulled off the field on passing downs, then I feel like that's fine.
Do you think he was really that good setting the edge against the run? Like he had flashes, but I didn't think he was particularly stout at it.
I thought he was significantly better than every other edge rusher that the Falcons had. So
but
maybe
that's not saying a lot.
Biasing me. Yeah, that's they were bottom 5 run defense. So
to me, I don't know how he's an asset there. I will say what could benefit them, and maybe this is more of Dennis Allen than Ryan Nielsen, but the Saints, they ran a bunch of cool blitz designs. But one thing I liked was they would run like a double. They would line up, I would say, like 6 at the line of scrimmage, and they would rush with both inside linebackers and the interior pass rushers, but then drop both edges into coverage. So that's maybe where the Felices and Lorenzo Carter could play inside it, because they love to dial up those delayed blitzes, those double A gap blitzes, and back with Dennis Allen. So maybe Carter's coverage ability could be useful there, because there's no denying he does possess that athleticism to have that range and just cover up ground. And I do recall him being a pretty good open field tackler as well, which is definitely needed, because you assume in these situations there's gonna be a lot of dump offs. So being able to make those open field tackles is key. So Overall, you can't be too upset, but you can't be too thrilled out of the move because I just think it's just a matter of let's utilize them properly. Actually have a defensive line rotation. I went the last 2 years because the Falcons have been relying on backup edge players to play 50-55 snaps a game, and we've seen how detrimental it's been.
Fair enough. Yeah. It was as the first move the Falcons made in the offseason was just like, really? Okay. And we'll it may or may not look better in context once, in a week or two, once we get more moves and we're like, okay, this is where he fits in. But sort of as the first piece in the jigsaw puzzle, you're just like, all right, I guess, sure, let's go with that. So we'll see what else is on the horizon for the Atlanta Falcons in this defense. Obviously, several other players, Isaiah Oliver, like Alan mentioned, you would imagine will be other priorities to resign. We'll see what happens with Kaleb McGary, as well as Olamide Zaccheaus and other players.
Keith Smith.
Sure. So we'll leave that conversation for future episodes of Locked On Falcons. But Alan, let the people know, what you're working on. You already teased an article that's dropping, so go ahead and continue to tease the listeners.
Well, it drops today, so yesterday. But I did my free agency wish list, which I did from 2015 to 2019. Made a comeback last year. Last year it was extremely difficult. So this year it felt like Christmas. Like, oh wow, I could look at the top tier players at certain positions and actually put realistically Jesse Bates and Isaiah Sumalo and Javon Hargrave and Alan Lazard. It's like, wow, these players could actually play for the Falcons, and I do think that they would be dream signings. So ultimately, I put together a piece. I mentioned a few players there where I list a couple of dream signings, some solid keepers, which are like mid-level signings. And to me, I just looked at the 5 positions I think the Falcons need the most. I do think they need a center, but the center market is, you thought the receiver market was underwhelming. The center market is somehow even worse. So instead of center, I used guard because I do think, man, if the Falcons really want to make a statement, they signed like a guy like Isaac Sumalo. That's going to be fun. Like, I think he was an unsung hero of Philly. Not to get too deep into my article, but you watch the Eagles offensive line. He did some serious work, particularly in the run game. So, yeah, I just thought of 10 players I think the Falcons should sign, and hopefully they sign 1 or 2 of them. In my, how many years? 6 years now of doing this piece, only 1 player they signed for my wish list. You know who it was, Aaron? Derek Shelby.
Wow. That takes me back.
Derek Shelby had his moments. He had his moments.
There you go. Well, guys, be on the lookout for that over at the Falcoholic. Of course, check out Alan at Alansterk, STRK. And continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And continue to watch today's episode because I'm going to eat some crow to wrap up today's episode. And yeah, so make us your first listen. And for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, all that and more, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What about Locked On Yellow Jackets?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, guys, here it is. They told me this was crow. Deep fried. Got my ranch dipping sauce. So here we go. All right, Locked On Mukbang. Pretty good. Tastes like chicken.